I never thought that my life could spiral so dramatically from one simple dinner invitation. But sometimes the most innocent moments can lead to the most unforeseen consequences. My name is Rachel, and this is my story of how a casual gesture turned my world upside down. It was a rainy Thursday evening, the kind where the clouds are so thick it feels like the sun never really rose. I was at home flipping through a stack of magazines, trying to distract myself from the emptiness of my own house. My husband, Mark, a financial consultant, was away on one of his frequent business trips. This time it was Tokyo. He was always away. And me? Well, I was always here, in our meticulously decorated but lifeless home in Chicago. Our marriage was fine. At least, that's what I always told myself. We had a beautiful home, stable careers, and friends who envied our seemingly perfect life. But over time, the connection that once felt unbreakable had withered. We spoke more through texts and quick phone calls than in person, and even when Mark was home, his mind was always elsewhere. I often felt more like a piece of the decor than a partner in his life. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Jonathan, Mark's colleague. He was the charming, charismatic type, always the life of the party at corporate events. We had crossed paths numerous times, but our interactions were usually just polite exchanges over hors d'oeuvres. The message read, "Hey Rachel, hope you're doing well. I heard Mark's out of town. Thought you might like some company. Care to join me for dinner tonight? Just two friends catching up." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. It felt odd, but then again, what harm could there be in having dinner with a friend? I was lonely, and the thought of getting out of the house was a tempting distraction. I typed back, "Sure, that sounds nice. Where should we meet?" Jonathan picked a cozy Italian restaurant downtown, the kind that had dim lighting and intimate booths. Perfect for quiet conversations, or so I thought. I slipped into a simple black dress and touched up my makeup, nothing too flashy, just enough to feel like I wasn't completely invisible. Walking into the restaurant, I was immediately hit by the rich aroma of garlic and fresh basil. Jonathan was already there. I was seated at a corner table with a bottle of red wine and a warm smile. As I approached, he stood up and pulled out my chair, something Mark hadn't done in years. "You look stunning, Rachel," he said, his eyes lingering a bit too long. I felt a faint blush creep up my cheeks. It had been a while since anyone had looked at me like that, let alone said it. We talked about everything: his work, Mark's latest projects, my hobbies that had turned into passing fancies. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and knowing glances. With each sip of wine, I felt a little lighter, a little less bound by the invisible chains of my everyday life. Jonathan was attentive, leaning in when I spoke, his eyes never wandering. It felt good, too good, to be the center of someone's world, even if just for a few hours. As the evening progressed, he shared stories about his recent trips, his ambitions, and even dropped a few subtle compliments that sent a warm flush through me. There was an ease between us, a connection that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. Then, as dessert was being served, a decadent tiramisu we decided to share, Jonathan reached across the table and gently brushed my hand. It was a brief touch, but it lingered in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. "I've always admired you, Rachel," he said softly, his voice laced with sincerity. "You're more than just Mark's wife. You're captivating." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I felt a rush of emotions I hadn't felt in years: desire, validation, fear. I knew this was crossing a line, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I met his gaze, feeling the pull of something I couldn't quite name. We finished dinner, and Jonathan insisted on driving me home. I hesitated, but the wine had softened my resolve. In the car, the conversation turned lighter, more playful. We laughed about the ridiculous office politics at their firm, joked about our mutual friends, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. When we reached my house, I expected the evening to end with a simple goodbye. But as I unbuckled my seatbelt, Jonathan leaned in, his face inches from mine. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I thought about pulling away, but I didn't. His lips brushed mine, softly at first, then with a fervor that surprised us both. I felt a surge of heat, an awakening of something that had been dormant for far too long. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it, savoring the thrill of being wanted, of being seen. but reality hit me like a cold shower. I pulled back, my heart racing. "Jonathan, we can't. I'm married to Mark, your friend." Jonathan leaned back, his expression conflicted. "I know, Rachel. I know, but tonight it felt like more than just dinner." I nodded, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I knew he was right. It wasn't just dinner. It was a reminder of everything I'd been missing. "Maybe we should just call it a night," I said, opening the door and stepping out into the chilly night air. Jonathan nodded, watching me as I walked up the steps to my front door. I glanced back once, catching his gaze before he drove off into the night. I woke up the next morning, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like a forbidden movie. I felt a knot in my stomach, a mix of guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. I wanted to talk to someone, but who? Mark was still away, and my friends wouldn't understand. As I made my way through the day, I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message from Jonathan, but there was nothing. Just the usual texts from Mark about his meetings and flight details. Everything felt so mundane, so normal. But I was far from feeling normal. I was on edge, waiting for something, anything to happen. That evening, my phone finally buzzed. It was Jonathan. A simple message. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I knew that responding could lead down a path I wasn't sure I wanted to take, but the temptation was strong. I typed back, "Sure, come over." Jonathan arrived at my door, looking more serious than the night before. We sat on the couch, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "Rachel, I'm sorry about last night. I didn't mean to complicate things," he said, his voice sincere. I nodded, trying to find the right words. "I know. It's just, I didn't expect to feel this way." Jonathan reached for my hand, holding it gently. "I don't want to mess up what you have with Mark, but I can't pretend that there isn't something here." His honesty was disarming. I felt torn between my loyalty to Mark and the undeniable connection I felt with Jonathan. In that moment, everything felt so clear, yet so confusing. Without thinking, I leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of desperation. Desperation to feel something, anything, other than the numbness that had settled into my life. We pulled back, both of us breathing heavily. I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The guilt was immediate, but so was the relief. It was as if a weight I didn't know I was carrying had been lifted. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and secret texts. Jonathan and I kept seeing each other, finding excuses to meet whenever Mark was away. I knew it was wrong, but the thrill of it all was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt alive. But it wasn't sustainable. The secrecy, the lies, it was all starting to take a toll. I found myself snapping at Mark over trivial things, avoiding his calls when I was with Jonathan. I was living two lives, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. One night, after another late dinner with Jonathan, I came home to find Mark sitting in the dark, waiting for me. My heart sank. He looked up, his eyes filled with hurt and suspicion. "Rachel, where have you been?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. I hesitated, my mind scrambling for an excuse, but I couldn't lie anymore. I was tired, exhausted from the web of deceit I had spun. "I was with Jonathan," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Mark's face fell, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. "Jonathan? My friend Jonathan?" I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I didn't mean for it to happen." Mark stared at me, the weight of my confession sinking in. He stood up, running a hand through his hair, a mix of anger and sadness etched on his face. "I trusted you, Rachel, and him. How could you both do this?" he shouted, his voice breaking. I couldn't find the words to defend myself. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and I knew there was no excuse that could make it right. "I thought we were fine. I thought you were happy," Mark continued, his voice cracking. I looked at him, tears streaming down my face. "I was happy, but I was also lonely. You're always away, Mark, and I lost myself somewhere along the way." Mark shook his head, turning away from me. "This isn't just about me, Rachel. You made a choice that hurt us both." We stood there in silence, the reality of our broken marriage settling around us like a heavy fog. I wanted to reach out to him, to fix what I had shattered, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The weeks that followed were filled with tense conversations and long, quiet nights. Mark and I tried to piece together what was left of our marriage, but the trust had been irrevocably damaged. We went to counseling, tried to rebuild, but it felt like we were just going through the motions. Jonathan and I ended things immediately after that night. He apologized, but I couldn't look at him the same way. He was a reminder of my mistakes, of the choices that led me here. I needed to find myself again, and that meant cutting ties with the past. Mark and I eventually decided to separate. It was a painful decision, but it was also necessary. We both needed time to heal, to figure out who we were without each other. As I packed up my things and moved into a small apartment downtown, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. My life had changed in ways I never expected, and I was left to pick up the pieces. Sometimes, life takes us down paths we never intended to walk. I never set out to hurt anyone, least of all my husband. But in the search for something more, I lost sight of what I already had. It's easy to get caught up in the thrill of the moment, to forget the consequences that follow. But if my story can serve as a reminder, let it be this: cherish what you have. Be honest, not just with others, but with yourself, because sometimes the price of a fleeting moment is far more than you ever imagined.